Welcome to the Captain's November. This month, all of my edited videos are going to be over the captain's quarters. I've never actually given this project its entire month before, so I'm really excited to dive in, especially now that this project is kind of undergoing a transition. If you're new to my channel, I highly suggest you go check through the playlist. This project is going from 17th century into the future. However, in this video specifically, I need to do some updates. The interior is looking, in my opinion, pretty good. You look at it and you're like, oh, okay, nice, yeah, I get it. 17th century ship captain's quarters. I see it. But the outside is looking a little... Ugh. I don't know. It's not good. It's not good. So it's definitely time to fix this problem and hopefully start building the outer shell that is actually the spaceship that this captain's quarters is contained within. Let's just turn this back around. There we go. You may also remember that I told you this is the month that you're going to meet the captain. Well, it's not going to be in this video, but it is going to be in a video that is coming soon. This is a great segue to remind you to hit the notification bell because then you'll know every time I post a new video. And that means you won't miss meeting the captain. So it's definitely time to get started on this project, but I will tell you, when I pulled it out this week, there was a problem. A big problem. And before I could do anything else, I had to fix it. When I had previously worked on this project, I added the ceiling on top of the top floor. I must have not let it dry underneath enough weight long enough, and it warped while I wasn't really paying attention to it. So I'm going to try and flatten it back out so I don't have to remove it and start over. To do this, I'm using a hair dryer to try and heat up the foam, and then I'm going to be putting a very heavy weight on one side to try and flatten it back out. I'm also going to be heating up the underside of the foam while the weight is on top. I'm hoping this will kind of relax the foam board and allow it to lay back down flat. I'm not using a heat gun because heat guns are way more powerful than a hair dryer and it can melt things pretty quickly. This took me quite a few rounds of heating and then waiting, and I kept measuring the gap to make sure it was getting closer and closer to being closed to see if this was even working. In the end, it was working. I did go get a hairdryer that had a little bit more heat to it, but it was working and I could tell that it was slowly flattening out. I think the key was to let the foam board cool down while the weight was on top, and it kind of gave it a new form. Once I was pretty close to the gap being closed, I added some tape so that it was closed completely even if it wasn't laying closed on its own. Then I flipped everything upside down and repeated the process, but with the top of it laying flat on my surface, and I just kept adding weight and heating. Once I was happy with everything, I still wanted to add some assurance that this wasn't going to happen again. I used a folded piece of black cardstock that I covered in glue as a kind of bracket that's going to hold the top of my roof to the side wall. I probably should have done this in the first place, but if I remember that week when I was filming the ceiling, it was kind of rushed and I didn't take all the precautions I needed to when working with foam board. Thank goodness that was somewhat easy to fix. It really did take me all day in order to let everything cool and let these pieces dry. I ended up putting black cardstock all the way around just to make sure this does not happen again. Foam board can definitely be a finicky building material. So of course, let's keep building with it. Before I do anything to make the outside look a little bit better, there are a few things that I have been putting off installing, such as the upper floor door and the wall safe that I built for the lower floor. So let's get started. I made this safe in a previous video on the Captain's Quarters playlist. It opens and closes with a locking mechanism, which makes it a really fun piece, but I never installed it into the wall. I'm going to be using a pin to push a hole through the wall on the inside because it's easier for me to tell where it needs to go on the interior. But that pin allows me to accurately place the safe on the outside of the wall so I can trace around it. This is going to be a much easier place to cut through the wall than trying to do it on the inside. I'm going to be using my craft knife and cutting very shallow cuts into the wall, going very slowly because I don't want to overcut and ruin the interior. It was a testament to how tough my walls are because it took me quite a while. There's a layer of wood glue on top of these and it made it very difficult to cut through. Once I was finally able to remove the square from the wall, I was able to test the safe in its place. Because I want it recessed into the wall, I made sure that it was a square that was as wide as the entire frame. In order to give it something to lean up against, I'm going to be creating a popsicle stick frame on the outside of the wall and then painting it so you can't see it once it's installed. I added glue all around the edge and then put it through the hole so that it butted up against the popsicle stick frame that's on the outside. It's now painted black, so it's a little hard to see. And I made sure that my latching mechanism was free and could still be used. I'm following the same exact idea for the door on the upper floor. This door is not going to be functional, so I just made a simple popsicle stick frame on the back so it had something to glue up against. Super simple, not super attractive, but it works. Now that I've got my door and my wall safe installed, I want to start building the little side room that I put in my plan a few videos ago. I went ahead and cut a base that is going to be the base for the spaceship part of this project. This is going to go underneath everything. The reason I went ahead and cut this out is so I know how much room I have to build this transitional space. It's the area where the captain can go from the spaceship, change into the 17th century uniform, and then continue into the 17th century space. So as you can see, this is going to make it a little bit bigger. I need to leave some room over here for some mechanisms to kind of hold the ship up. And then over here, I'm going to have that transition space, and then there's going to be a long hallway going this way, which will end in the spaceship doors. Or depends on the spaceship. In my design, I have this piece lifted up slightly, and that's so it kind of looks like it's floating and being held by these pistons that would kind of help it rock back and forth and move like an actual ship, even though it isn't on a ship. So in order to lift it up, I'm going to use a little bit more of this foam, and I'm going to kind of put it towards the back of this area, and hopefully it will be hidden enough so that it looks like it's floating. Obviously I won't leave it pink because that would be pretty noticeable, but we'll kind of play around with it, see what I can make happen. So it does look like this is floating off of the front right here, and I think that is high enough. It doesn't need to have any more space underneath here, so I think that's good. This is where I'm going to be building this changing room, and it's going to have one door here that goes into the lower level, and then it's going to have a room with a bench, and then another door here that goes into the rest of the spaceship, which you'll just kind of have to imagine. So the wall will go in front of the safe, so you will not see this. One foamboard room later. Day 2 of working on the captain's quarters. Well, actually it's day 3 because it took me a whole day to fix the roof. It's kind of going a little bit slow, so I'm not sure how much I'm going to get done in this video, but I went ahead and built this room that's supposed to go on the side here. It's supposed to look like it's levitating as well, so I'll have to add some foam board to go underneath this, but it fits just like so. Anyways, I'll have to do a whole nother episode on this room itself, making it with the bench and the doors, making it look like a spaceship type area. But the reason I wanted to at least make the shell in this video is so that I knew what areas I needed to cover on the outside. So that's my goal for today, just to make this less ugly and make a little bit more sense on the exterior. That's where some of this experiment is going to come in handy. I did a whole episode where I was playing around with ideas for spaceship finishes. I think it's called Greebling. Y'all taught me a new word and I need to say it correctly. A greeble, or apparently it's pronounced greebly, is a prominent detailing added to the surface of a larger object that makes it appear more complex and therefore visually interesting. It usually gives the audience an impression of increased scale. This is why many times it's used in sci-fi movies or sci-fi buildingscapes. I knew there was going to be somewhat of a problem when it came to the side of the captain's quarters that has the stained glass window. This is because on the lower level there are a ton of wires that go to the interior ship cases that hold the ships. So I needed to create a wall to cover these up to where they were still accessible. I made these little foam board hooks that are going to hold a larger foam board wall onto the side of the captain's quarters. I made 3 individual hooks. They're basically just 2 pieces of foam board glued together in a stair-step fashion. I taped the long, thin piece of foam board onto them that it needs to hold up, so I made sure I was putting them on straight, and then I permanently glued the hooks to the side of the foam board. Then I could remove the straight piece, which I was going to build my wall off of. This took a little bit of care to make sure I didn't unglue the pieces I just put on. But once it was untaped, it was easy to pull it in and out. After this, I could add another thin piece on top. This thin piece is what I'm going to be able to glue my wall onto. I cut the wall out of foam board again, just to match what I've previously done. I made a few interesting cuts on the edges because I did want this to look as though it was a sci-fi element. Now I can take this thin piece that I previously created, glue it to the back of my wall, and this is going to create the hook system that's going to make this a removable wall. Here you can see how it just sits on top of the foam board pieces I previously glued. When you view it from the front, this is how it looks. It's a pretty simple design, but it's going to save me some future wiring headache if I ever have any issues. So now it's time to do the greebly, or the greebling. I'm going to take all of my papers out of my scrap pile and then also grab just some of the random pieces that I have in my toolbox, and these are all going to come together to create the sci-fi paneling for the side of the captain's quarters. I'm cutting all these pieces into rectangles. There's even some I've used on my laser cutter, and so they made interesting shapes once I cut them into bits. I'm also cutting out some very thin, long pieces that are just going to be interesting pieces that I can glue on. There's not really any rhyme or reason for how I'm adding these things onto the wall. I'm really just adding shapes and patterns that I find interesting, and if I find a spot that's kind of blank, I look for something that would fit there or create a bit of interest. This ended up being a really fun process. I highly suggest it, even if you want to just have some fun. Even if you're not doing a sci-fi project, but you just want to use some of your scraps, it's really fun to create one of these panels. Once I was finished, I turned it over and used a sharp blade to cut off any of the excess material that's coming off the side of the wall. And this is how it ended up looking. Right now it just looks like a bunch of paper and wood bits, but I'm about to change that. I'm using my mixture of black Mod Podge, it's just black paint and Mod Podge, and I'm going over the entire thing. This is going to give me a cohesive painting surface, and it's also going to make sure everything is stuck down permanently. I'm painting both sides of the wall at the same time, so it lessens the likeliness that it will warp. While that's drying, I wanted to work on the wall itself. So above where the wires are going to be and around the stained glass windows, I want this to look as though someone's just taking a ton of sheet metal and is trying to keep the wall together. I'm using different thicknesses, so when I apply the cardstock over the chipboard, you can see I'm using my fingernail to push in a crease around that area. That's going to make it look like there is a bunch of sheet metal underneath as well, and they've just been continually adding metal on top over the years. This process did take quite a while, of course. All good miniature projects do take a lot of time, but I really do like how the result came out. It's a little bit difficult to see. My camera's having a really hard time with all this white foam board and white paper, but you will be able to see it a little bit better when I add the metallic on top. Here you can see the wall panel in place with all the paper up above, and I still have a little bit to go, but I'm so thankful it's covering up what was underneath. Now I'm going to go over the entire thing again, just like I did the wall panel, with the black Mod Podge to make sure everything's completely stuck down. This also gives me a good base coat. It was still hard for me to see the edges, so I went over it with the metallic silver just so I could see the individual panels a little bit better. The reason for this is because I wanted to add some rivets. No metal spaceship wall is going to be complete without rivets. I started going the, I guess I would say, lazy way, which is just wood glue, and while I do think you'd be able to see a little bit of it, it started drying really flat. So my daughter brought me some of these drills left over from one of her diamond paintings, and I started gluing those on top of my wood glue dots, and I knew those would stand out for sure. And in fact, I really enjoyed how they ended up looking because they are multifaceted and the light shines on them in so many different ways. And she brought me a ton of them in this little Monster High drawer of hers and said I could use as many as I wanted. This was another process that of course took quite a bit of time. I worked on it well into the night, but I think it was worth it. I didn't end up putting rivets on to every single part of the wall, but I tried to put it where I thought it made sense. Of course, there would be a few pieces that were just welded and not riveted, so I just kind of made up my own stories for each piece of metal in my mind to make myself feel better about not doing the entire thing. Once I was happy with everything, I covered it in a layer of that same Mod Podge, and now I'm going over it with a coat of silver paint. This is what's really going to bring everything to life. I'm trying to keep my brush strokes both horizontal and vertical to make it look like brushed metal, and in the end, this is how it ends up looking. I think it's really starting to come across as metal and no longer paper with little bits of plastic glued on top. It's the next day and I'm pretty happy with how this metal paneling is looking, but I have to remember that this side is actually not going to be seen that much because the project is going to be facing this way and there's going to be a wall very close. So what I need to do now is figure out how I'm going to translate that side to the front, because this aesthetic is very different from this one. So what I want to do now is take these same techniques and kind of implement them around the front. Because I'm trying to make it look like this captain's quarters has been encapsulated inside of the metal, I need some of that metal going over the edges, looking like it's holding everything together. I may not get it all done in time for this video, but I want to at least get a sample done so that you can see what I'm doing. And by the next time I make a video, I will have it completely done. So I might do some of it off camera, but you will know all the steps that I took to complete it. Okay, let's finish it up. Well, let's finish it up. There we go. I felt like this part of the process was much more simple and a lot more fun. I just took some of that same cardstock, I bent it over the edge and then glued it down. This is going to look like individual pieces of sheet metal that were put onto the very top of the captain's quarters and wrapped around, trying to keep it all together. I also cut some other shapes that were a little bit more like the shapes I wanted inside of the spaceship part, and I glued those in areas where I had a little bit more space to work with. So here's where all the pieces ended up. It'll be a little bit easier to see once I paint it. And of course, I had to add all of the rivets, so that was another chunk of time getting those on there, but I really do think they add so much to the realism, or maybe even the fantasy behind this project. It was at this point I realized I had a great opportunity to mess with this battery pack that's been hanging off the side of this project for a while now. It's been really annoying. I'm going to be hiding it behind this panel. I'm going to glue it to the wall with the button or the switch facing forward so there's easy access, and so that the screws are facing out, so if I do need to remove the wall and change the battery, I can easily take the screw side off. I also tacked the wire to the wall with some hot glue, and then I painted the surface just a little bit so it didn't stand out too much from the metallic finish that's going to be all around it. The fact that I had a wire hiding back there gave me the idea to add some more wires. These are Christmas ornament hangers that they have every year at Dollar Tree. I love to buy them and use them as wires in my miniature projects. So cheap, and there's so many of them. I'm using something round to create a more interesting shape in the wire, and then I'm going to be attaching it to the back of this panel. This is because you're going to be able to see between the panel and the actual wall, and this is going to make it look like there's a purpose for that there is actually wiring back there, and that's why there is a gap. I'm checking to make sure I like the effect before I glue everything in place. I also decided to add an extra wire that's just going through it. Honestly, you can just kind of do whatever you want and have fun with it. But I really love that the green stands out, and so I just left it that normal Christmas green, which still comes across as a wire green because wires are normally done in some kind of color. Now that I've got this side pretty close to done, I'm ready to start aging it a little bit. I also want to add some more metallic colors to the panels to make it look like different types of metal had been used over time. I'm also not going too heavy-handed with the wiring just yet because there is going to be some exposed wiring once I build the spaceship encasement. I really want to have some lights that are shining up into the stained glass windows, and so there's going to be some exposed lighting. I really want it to look as if someone has built a structure within the spaceship to make the interior of the captain's quarters feel more realistic. Now it's time to do the aging. I grabbed a handful of my metallic paints, and I'm not sure if I really like the green, but I wanted to go ahead and give it a try. All I'm going to do is paint over some existing panels, the shapes that I had already created. There's not really any reason why I'm picking certain ones. I'm just trying to spread out the colors a little bit. The metallic stood out a little bit more than I wanted them to. I thought it started to kind of look like a patchwork quilt, so I went over everything with another layer of silver paint. Metallic paints are somewhat transparent, so you can typically see what color is underneath them. That means you can play around with the layers and get all sorts of effects by layering them on top of each other. I felt much more comfortable with the effect I was getting with just a little bit of a color change as opposed to just really bright colors. Now it was time to get a little messy with the aging. I wanted to use some watered down black paint to make this part look rather old. I'm starting with the removable wall panel because it's the easiest. I can lay it down flat on my work surface. I'm using some glossy black paint for this. I heard from a friend, Sean, thank you, that using glossy black paint in your watered down wash will stay a little bit better than matte black paint, and I do feel like it didn't disappear as much as it has when I've used matte black in the past. This is my first go at trying to get all of the watered down black paint in the crevices, and you can just add as much or as little as you want. While that was still drying because I'm really impatient, I decided to go ahead and add a few rust effects. I'm just using one color for this. I might add more later, but I'm just using a brown to go over with a stiff, small brush, and I'm just adding little daubs of paint here and there, and I'm using my finger whenever I feel like I get a little bit too much on there. Doing this on the side of the captain's quarters was a little bit more difficult because it's a little bit bigger and it wouldn't lay flat because it would go, my safe is on the other side, so I couldn't just lay it down. I was also having a hard time seeing where I was putting things because the metallics were so bright and shiny. I was having to move my lights around so I could actually see the effects that I was getting. Here's a closer up view of how I'm doing the rust effects. It really is just a simple process of dabbing paint on. You can kind of think of where moisture might build up. So if there was air conditioning within the captain's quarters, maybe some of that condensation built up underneath the windows and dripped down the metal panels. So I tried to think of areas where that rust would actually be. So here's a close look of how this is turning out. I'm having so much fun with this, especially around the windows. I love the side of this project now, whereas before It was an eyesore, a literal eyesore within my studio, and now I'm hesitant on actually putting it inside of something because I love the effect that much. So this is what I was able to get done for this video. Obviously, this is just one side of the two that need to be finished. But I wanted to show you what I meant by there being a spaceship wall here. So there's going to be a wall that goes up like so, that's going to contain the captain's quarters within it, which is why I mentioned that you wouldn't really be able to see the side that much. However, you still will be able to see it, so I'm happy I took some time to make it look a little bit better. I'm going to use the same techniques on the other side over here above this room so that I can call the exterior of the captain's quarters finished. This is a great step to get done because that means I can start building the spaceship and not worrying about having to backtrack. Let me know what you thought of the transformation in the comments down below. I may even add like some big beams that look like they're just like running across the entire side, but I don't know. Let me know. Do you think I need to add anything or move on from this and save all the really detailed greebling to the inside of the spaceship? Greebling. Greebing? Remember to stay tuned. All this month I will be making the Captain's Quarters content for every edited video. Happy Captain's November. Bye.